Thank you, Devanshi. Very good evening to all of you viewers in India. And of course, good morning to our viewers and friends in the United States. Once again, we are back for the next version of what we have been doing for the last few days, reinventing Parliament and the future of democracy. In some ways, today's discussion has brought an extraordinary individual who has been a key actor in politics and governance in India. We are very delighted to welcome our guest, Mr. Nalin Kohli, who will be speaking a little later in the course of today's discussion. We have, of course, our usual suspects and familiar people who are here, including Bradley and Scott and also Shekhar, and welcome to all of them, and Alexander for joining us today. I want to say that we are indeed, as we move forward in this evolutionary phase of lockdown and opening up, some of the more fundamental assumptions relating to the working and functioning of our institutions have come into question. And this includes the possibility of decision making at the highest level, including Parliament and Congress and other institutions in different parts of the world, but also to what extent technology can enable us to help address some of the problems. For example, as a university that I am heading, we have moved our entire classes online. Today, the University of Cambridge has announced that for the entire next year, 2021, they will have classes online. We have universities across the United States who are also braving to start the campus in a physical manner, but also may have partially online. So technology is going to play a very significant role in the future. Then the question is to what extent technology can also shape the exercise of power. Last episode, we heard Alexander and Shekhar talk about the various dimensions of exercise of power, including the use of technology, and to what extent the future will determine netocracy as a framework of governance. Today, we are going to extend this conversation more particularly to focus on elections and voting, and possibly the very functioning of political parties and how they are going to impact the parliament in the cloud and the future of democracy. With those introductory words, I would like to invite Nishith to say a few words, and then we'll have Scott and Bradley say a few words before we get to Nalin. Nishith, over to you.
Yeah, I got muted by you. Professors and politicians mute me off at times. In letter vein, don't get me wrong. It's such fun. So let me just say thank you, Nalin. Thank you for coming on, and thank you, Alexander, Shekhar. You've been really wonderful. I think you've done all the three, and I think your commitment to the new ideas is unmatched. And it's so nice to hear. So I think just to recap for those who have not attended earlier two sessions, what we are trying to do is to look at two things. One is the current operational, situation about the parliament, and because of social distancing and because of the pandemic, the lockdown and stuff like that, it has become very difficult for parliament, members of parliament to come together, and possibly it is not happening at the moment. I'm not sure Nalin can graduate us a little bit more, but in any case, if we cannot meet physically, at least next best option is to meet in the cloud. And virtual meetings of even 500 people, Raj and us have been some of these webinars and stuff like that with all 2,000-3,000 people joining, and so well coordinated discussion happens, and so that is one part. And when we go deep down into that, and we now even find that British Parliament with 200-300 members have also been meeting in the cloud now. And so with technology, I think it is becoming, easier to, get together. I know the WebEx, webinars and others, there is a degree of fatigue also people are getting. As you know, as a research-based law firm and education, this must be about 130th webinar we must be holding in last 6 or 7 months, educating people on all different kind of subjects, including tomorrow we are going to have an interesting discussion on designer babies. So, how do you work around regulations? What do you do about CRISPR is going to come in next 5, 10 years, and a lot of interesting things are happening. So we have to start working on those kind of things today. And I would not go too deep into that. But one subject we want to uh, possibly uh, discuss, debate, whatever it is. Now, at least time has come where Parliament can meet in the cloud, and some discussion, some progress can be done. So there is one part. Technology allows us. Second part is the very form of the current representative democracy. And all of you know that, 2000 years ago, the Athenian style direct democracy came in. Of course, before that, there were 500 years. Socrates, it was 500 BC, and 2000 was about Athenian democracy. So it took 500 years for them from concept to the actual happening in Athens. And then it was in the year 930 in Iceland that representative democracy came. 1100 years have gone by. We got to find a new model. It has its own benefits. It has its upside. It has downside. But we also see that there are a lot of issues with the representative democracy. We found that Athenian style direct democracy also can lead to chaos. But now, and the representative democracy also has brought its own ills with that. For example, really speaking, are the representatives or the members of parliament do really represent the people's wishes, or after the power of attorney is given, then it is they are able to vote in accordance with their own thinking, or secondly, partisanship, crowding out is happening, and sometimes crowding out the sensible process and progress as well. Third issue is there is deeply embedded corruption at times. I'm not talking about everyone, I'm talking general. you know the next point is that there is also at times there is lack of decorum in many times, not always. Again, these are all situations we have seen. Poor attendance at times, participation record again is not that great at times. Unequal power structure in bicameral legislatures lead to power plays and suboptimal solutions. Undemocratic party discipline whip, and highly unstable coalition governments and fractured mandate you get sometimes. Dysfunctional at times in existential crisis, it can bring lockdown, wars, etc. And huge maintenance costs. This is the very important part in terms of time, energy, and expenses. So these are some of the things. Not that this is a general rule and everywhere it happens, but by and large, these are the things. Now, what is the next thing that we can do? And I always think that we create the world that we want. Now, if these are the elements, these are the issues of current democracy, can we think of something better? Because today we have a time to think, ideate, refine, experiment, and stuff like that. And but suddenly, if you are not prepared, then tsunami of technology comes, and suddenly everything becomes upside down. So that is a second point. And the role of parliament is to frame legislations. And there also big data, analytics, AI can play a big role. Plus, there are many models like Amazon. I always say, 20 years ago, we were told that okay, there is no need for brick and mortar malls. uh, we thought it was a good story. Okay, fine. Some people believed in it and paid billions of dollars, and valuations went. People were surprised. How come one .com gets $1 billion? Okay. Now, over a period of time, that is more of a reality than many other shopping malls are closing down. And I am not being judgmental here, but similarly, Wikipedia is another example which allows us to draft definitions, and if you want to draft law, there are three parts: definitions, operational part, and penalties, prosecution, or consequence. So one third job has already been done by Wikipedia. So if you want to have drafting of definitional cause, it could be done through crowdsourcing, and it has people have accepted it quite a bit as far as Wikipedia is concerned, and it can have a real-time element to anything as well. Now we have to do, the operational part, and the which can be done with AI and with the data analytics and stuff like that. So how the what is the proportionality, what uh, of the consequences and stuff like that. I don't want to go into detail, but today we have many tools to organize all these things, and our energies can be spent on higher level. Now, as lawyers, we all know that we used to spend days and hours and sometimes weeks to research case laws and other kind of stuff. A lot of energy went into that. Today, it is on the fingertip. All that we need to do is to apply mind and interpret the law and argue. So, technology has really enabled us. But where do we draw limit to technology, or how do we deal with the technology is another ethical issues that could come up. And my friend Vivek Vadva in Silicon Valley wrote a book called Driver in the Driverless. So in the driverless car, yes, fine. But if there is an animal coming in front of car, how will you manage it? Whether the car should kill the animal or injure the passenger inside? Those are the ethical issues which are very difficult to manage, and those kind of things we'll have to focus on. But today, technology can allow us to have safer cars, because driverless cars will be safer than the humanly driven cars. So those are kind of things that are coming up, and I can go on and on, but I just thought that it's a time to at least just think that, so this is not uh, just one solution per se, but I think we have to think that what is the next level where we can go. So after for last about 8-10 years, I've been researching on the subject, and the concept which is in between direct democracy and representative democracy is being discussed more and more, called liquid democracy, is somewhat fluid, where individuals have, with technology, they have power to vote on any issue, and they can appoint representative where they want to. If they do not want, they can go direct, and if they can have appoint even more than one representative for issue-based decision making. And those are the kind of things that are coming up. Once again, I'm not going to take away all the time today, but I thought I'll just, the technology is another important part, important thing that in the democracy we will be seeing more and more of that. And let me over to Raj. And I'm not sure Brad has joined us or not, but if he has not, and if Alexander want to say a few words, or Shekhar, so Nalin has some background on what we discussed. So
Thank you, Nishith. Thank you, Nishith, for setting the stage for this discussion. I'm going to invite, since Scott is already here, Scott, can I invite you to make your observations as we move forward and ultimately we'll reach to Nalin? Scott.
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. So,
hear you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Nishith and Raj. My observations are, I look at technologies as reshaping every aspect of our life, including the government. And I try to look at things from an engineering point of view, like how can you optimize the quality of life for the citizens? Whenever, a lot of times we get into discussions of a liquid versus a direct democracy, etc., but we should always step back and say, what's the whole point of this? And the whole point of this is to optimize the quality of life of the individuals. And the economy is a big part of that, obviously. And so we look at the role of technology has always been to give us additional freedom. When we have cars and planes and boats, we can traverse the globe. When we're left to our feet, well, we can't do that, This internet has allowed us all to convene from all over the world. That's a power. That's a freedom we did not have a century ago, to do this on the spot. So how do you use technology to improve your lifestyle? And I'll give you an example. A company that I've invested in called Fathom, FATHYM.com, addressed an issue for programmers. So programmers, if you ask them, how much do you like your job? Often they say, I hate my job because of 80% of the job is involved in doing rote things, routine things over and over and over again. And So at Fathom, we said, can you make a button you push and it just does that part for the job? And then they can spend their time doing what they really love, which is being creative and programming. And if you do that, you can increase their efficiency 5-fold. So I take the same thing and I look at the government and I look at, as a business person, often we've spent 50% of our time of the business earning the money for the taxes that we have to pay. So even on an individual earning $100,000 in the US, they'll generally pay about $50,000 in taxes. So that means the first half of the year, everything they're doing is just to provide the taxes. So how do you reduce taxes? The other part is what an individual or a corporation has to do to comply, not only with the taxes, but other regulations. And there are a lot of studies that have shown corporations spend about 30% of their overhead in compliance and taxes. Well, add that, to the equation, it's an enormous amount of inefficiency. So how can technology make that more efficient? Okay. So technology has given rise to a monetary economy that people just take for granted, and nor do they really understand its size. And so if you were to observe the size of the economy, the best way to size the economy is the total payments being made. And here's what you find, something astounding. 16 in the US economy, and this is going to be similar in the Indian economy or most of the major nation economies. In the US economy, our wages, our income represent about $16 trillion a year. So we're getting all of the government revenue out of tapping into that. Sales taxes, property taxes, income taxes come out of that $16 trillion. But the total economy in the US, if you take the total payments in the US, it's $5,000 trillion. So the income represents less than 1/3 of 1% of the total payments out there. This is, you're taxing that, you're sort of taxing the wrong thing. If you were to use the technology of financial settlements, the payment system, and you were to shave off 0.2%, just $2 out of every $1,000 in payments went, you could completely get rid of the income taxes. You could get rid of sales taxes, and you could get rid of property taxes. You wouldn't need state taxes or federal taxes. So somebody earning $100,000, their taxes drop down to $200 instead of $50,000. It's kind of ludicrous to be taxing income when we could be using the financial settlements that flow through the economy and shaving a tiny fraction off of each of those settlements. If we were to do that in the US economy at 0.2%, we not only would be able to balance our current budget, but we would have so much money left over, we would actually be able to pay every citizen in the US $2,000 a month or $24,000 a year in basic income, regardless of what their wealth is. And we could provide free healthcare, and we could also provide free college. So you suddenly have this system that is much more efficient. You're spending 2/10 of the year instead of 50% of the year working for the government. You're actually receiving benefits from the government of universal basic income, healthcare, and college, and you're booming the economy when you do that. And when you model what happens to the total payments, when you boom that economy with that extra basic income and the release from income taxes, your total payment should rise from 5,000 trillion upwards to 6,000 or 7,000 trillion, providing you've only more revenue to do this thing. So that, from my viewpoint, that's not an ideology. That's not a philosophy. It's neither liberal nor conservative. That's recognizing the technology that exists around you, the payment system, looking at where your headache is, just like we looked at where are the programmers' headaches, what buttons can you push to change that? And by flipping some switches, suddenly you have the citizens of the US having additional personal income free from taxes, and yet you do it in a way that booms the economy, stimulates the economy. It's a win-win situation. And it all comes from recognizing the financial technologies that impinge upon our daily life and our business affairs. Once you see that, the answer is obvious, which is always the case in a paradigm shift. In a paradigm shift, you initially start off with what you feel are intractable problems: growing national debt, growing deficits, high tax rates, a population in which 50% of the population in the US doesn't even have a net worth of $500. And then you switch that over through just a few switches of the levers in the payment system, and you go from a rather dystopic situation to a more utopic situation. That's what the Financial Freedom Act is about. And it's technologically based from my perspective.
So Scott has
Thank you very much, Scott.
Sorry for my interruption, but by the way, Scott has initiated Financial Freedom Act based on this technology and that kind of stuff. Just for information, please go ahead.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Scott, for really connecting that to our current discussion. Is Brad around? Is Brad come back?
Yes, I'm here.
Yes,
oh, great.
Okay, great. So would you like to make your comments?
And sure, and just so I have a better understanding, I should be talking about, because my company is focused on free speech and things like that, but should I be focused on democracy in particular, or should I focus on what I do, or what's best?
You should focus a bit on democracy, but also on free speech.
I'm sorry?
A bit on democracy, but definitely on free speech.
Yeah, so I guess my perspective in general, having lived in the U.S. over the past, I mean, I'm 36, so I've lived in the U.S. my whole life. I would say that broadly speaking, there's been a belief here and acceptance here that the political systems work and the democratic systems broadly work, and that the trajectory, while slow, is broadly speaking moving towards progress and acceptance and enlightenment and those other things. And it has not been playing out that way over the past few years, to the point where I think now there's a lot of disillusionment with politics. I can say that for me personally, in 2010, I went to graduate school in Washington, D.C., working on international politics and policy advocacy. And I decided to drop out because I thought that politics was not the place where anything actually changes. So I returned to entrepreneurship thinking that politics didn't really have a role in changing the way that systems work. I still kind of believe that, in the sense that I don't think that if you give the politicians more time, they make better decisions. I think if you give them more time, they make worse decisions over time. And that ultimately the thing that forces change is that the technology works differently. So when the technology works differently, politicians have to change. Before the internet, politicians didn't have to do certain things. Post-internet, now they have to do new things. And that changes the way that people are able to express themselves in the world. So what my company is working on, Unstoppable Domains, we are working on building a censorship-resistant internet. So these are alternate tools to build websites and other applications that can only be put up and taken down by the creator. So we have a domain registry called .crypto. People can launch websites. The domains are on a blockchain, meaning that the user controls the domain name themselves. So with the traditional .com domain, GoDaddy or your registrar is the controller of your domain name, and they can take it away from you. They can move it around. Your website can go down at their whim. With a blockchain domain, user store it with your private key, and somebody has to get your private key in order to move it around. Your website is stored on a peer-to-peer storage network. This is similar to like BitTorrent or other peer-to-peer networks that folks may be familiar with. It is not stored on Amazon Web Services or Alibaba Cloud or any of the other places where traditional companies store their web content. So if you have your domain controlled by you, if you have your website stored on a peer-to-peer network, then only you can put up your website and take it down. And this is what makes it censorship resistant. And if you look around the world right now, I think it's fair to say that governments all around the world are using the internet as a way to control what people say. And applications and companies are doing the same thing. Facebook and YouTube and others are essentially the determiner of what free speech, where the line is for free speech. Facebook actually gets to decide, okay, you can say this and you can't say that. That is not the way that I think most of us probably thought that free speech was going to be adjudicated in the future. It's certainly not the way that I think free speech should be adjudicated. And so we're in this place now where technology tools are very close to being able to change the balance completely, where the user will be able to publish what they want, and it's going to be up to companies and other powerful people to reckon with what they're saying. And they will no longer be able to turn them off. They may be able to argue with them or debate with them, but it's going to be very different when they can't just turn them off. And I think this is going to have an impact potentially everywhere. So this is the reason why we're focused on this. We think that when you introduce a new technology paradigm, that's the best way to change the political landscape. And this should happen everywhere. I mean, I think we can come up with many cases in the United States where content is taken down. There are many cases in India, especially recently, where content is being taken down, in particular for unpopular political views or religious views or things like that. It's happening all over the world, and it's getting worse. And it's because there's a flaw in the technology. So anyway,
Right.
If you're curious about learning more, it's Unstoppable Domains.
Thank you very much, Brad. All right, I'm going to call Nalin, but before that, if Nishith or Alexander, if you have a quick comment, please make it, and then we'll go to Nalin.
Questions, but just how the world will look like, because who decides the content and what are the implications of this is some big question mark, because if if you can, it's unstoppable by definition. That's the name of the company. So it's very interesting technology. How do you deal with them? And what is, I'm not being in judgment here, but at the same time, I think these are the kind of things that we're going to see more and more in the world tomorrow. And maybe Bright could have some views, or Shekhar could say, and I think at least got two people speak here on technology, so it will be useful to get their views. And I think Nalin would be able to react after listening to everybody, and it will be a very interesting interaction. Thank you, Brett.
Okay, if I can add anything to this, I think the bigger picture is interesting in the sense that I'm obviously studying the trade routes at the moment of history for a new book I'm working on, and it's much more interesting to see the picture like if communication isn't flawless, if communication can flow, if you're creating hindrances to communication, then you will not benefit from all the new technologies that will be available to us, say, over the next 50 years or so. So this, at the end of the day, we talked about it the other night. This is the end of the day question to me about, for example, the Chinese Communist Party and the way it tries to run a dictatorship in China, and the response to their model is one where as a censorship, a system of censors everywhere and information flows. The more these information flows can flow without interruption, the more you benefit from them. And therefore, the question here of free speech, for example, is a much bigger issue. It's an issue of, will you let communication flow as freely as possible for the benefit of all, or will you try to stop free information flows because at the end of the day, you will not benefit from any system like that? In China's case, that means China cannot be innovative. It can only mimic, it can only copy, it cannot be innovative. It cannot move into the mode of innovation because of its attempt to try to create a dictatorship. So democracy to me is a question of a society of plurality for innovation itself.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Shekhar, do you want to add anything to what has been said so far before I invite Nalin?
I think we're overselling democracy here.
He was listening to it. So anyway, maybe he will come back.
Can you hear me?
Shekhar, yes.
Shekhar, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. So as everybody was speaking, I tried to ask myself why people vote. You know, when we talk about institutions and we talk about bigger things and we talk about information flows and the morality of not being able to take things down, I went back, and I've always been a great admirer and a great, always saying that ultimately technology will win. I'm just thinking, why do people vote? Is voting an individual act? Is it an individual choice, or is it a social choice? Is it a group choice? What is it? Every time so far when we've had elections, people have come out, people have celebrated, people have they've celebrated, they've protested. Is it like a social act, or is it an individual act? If we take technology in its extreme form and say, okay, everybody will be sitting at home, everybody will press a button and they'll come and not go out and make it a huge societal, a huge social thing, I think people will lose interest in democracy. I think people won't bother to vote. And then we'll have this huge thing of very, very few people voting, and that's how dictatorships are formed. Very often they just, sometimes, when you look at the voting patterns and you really understand it, you realize very few people are moving democracy. So I was just thinking this, and I wanted to put this question to everybody else. What is voting? Why do people vote? Because you want change? Or of course. But is voting also a social act, like going to a protest meeting, sitting down in a group of people discussing, and is it an emotional act? That's the question that I'm asking myself right now.
Thank you so much, Shekhar. That takes us so beautifully to our key speaker this evening, Nalin Kohli. I want to take this moment to introduce Nalin Kohli, who is a distinguished Indian politician, but also an advocate of the Supreme Court of India. He's a member of and one of the official spokespersons of the Bharatiya Janata Party. He's also been the convener of the BJP's National Media Cell. Mr. Kohli is also former prime-time news anchor of India's national television, Doordarshan, and has had a very distinguished career there. On a more personal note, I would say he's one of the most, humble and self-effacing politicians I have met. So we're very delighted that Nalin accepted our invitation. Nalin, over to you.
Good evening, and thank you very much for those very kind words, Raj, Nishith, Scott, Alexander, Brad, and the others who are on this panel. Shekhar asked a very interesting question. Now, what I was hoping to do is, in the next few minutes, I hope my audio is good and there's no issues with that.
Very good.
Thank you. Thank you. So what I was hoping to do is really just broadly speak about India in terms of what does an impact of, say, technology or a major change, a technological change mean for India? How do we look at politics in India? And I'll give a few examples how it doesn't translate like anywhere else in the world. We are the world's most raucous and largest democracy. I mean, 1 billion plus people and almost 1 billion voters. I mean, it's huge. Then what, as we were speaking in the afternoon with Nishith Bhai and Raj and Pratibha, is liquid democracy, this concept. And I had the opportunity of reading some of the material that they sent to me. So how would that maybe function in a country like India, or the cloud, democracy in the cloud? And finally, maybe a couple of comments on what Brad was saying in terms of how you were speaking about technology and free speech. So that's how broadly I was hoping to take this small little, few comments of mine. So let me start first with Shekhar. Shekhar said, why do people vote? Now, it's a good question. Many years ago, I tried to ask this of myself. And as a lawyer, I guess the only way I could define it was, it's like, why does a person vote for a candidate in a choice of, so many? And my assessment was, right or wrong, that it's like a power of attorney. And somebody goes out there, the vote is actually a power of attorney given by the voter to that candidate, that I'm now giving you charge for the next 5 years. Now, that is either for change or even in some cases status quo. So it's really literally like if you sell land, and as a lawyer, we use that term. You ask somebody and say, I'm giving you the authority to do so. So a vote is a very temporary power, like a power of attorney. It can be withdrawn and completely, and that's what it is. It can be continued, renewed at the end of that termination period of 5 years or whenever the election is held. And I'm not sure it's always for change, because change is obviously hope-driven, but it's also anger-driven at times. And anger is, while a negative emotion, it can also be a great driver for change. Sometimes it's status quo. People just don't want change. They want really what they are, within which they want to stay in that little cocoon. And that's why they vote for someone who represents that. So it's very, very varied. And I don't think we can find any one single answer for that, which would uniformly work across the world. Let's take India, 1.3 billion people. We are a very layered civilization. It's not really a society, it's a civilization in a sense. There's so much of economic, socio-economic, cultural diversity and disparity that you see multiple layers interacting, conversing with each other all the time. So as an example, it's not impossible to see literally a Mercedes-Benz or a very, very modern new car and a horse-drawn cart or a bullock cart in the same time zone and space. It's not an impossibility. That's the kind of disparity that we have. And therefore, the nature of democracy in a country like India becomes very unique. So, to put it broadly, it's really sometimes I wonder whether it's at the lowest common denominator rather than the highest common denominator. So democracy is based on this principle that you have a rational, intelligent, informed, literate, educated voter who has rationally looked at everything and then exercised their choice. But that's not necessarily true. Because in one factor, for those who understand, say, the Indian caste system, would realize that in India, very often, votes are not cast, but your caste is really voted in. So it's your social affinity or your social grouping that may actually determine how you vote, not necessarily anything to do with what you are, in a wider egalitarian sense, expecting from the democratic process. So in this kind of a scenario, where does technology come in? Now, obviously, technology is a great tool. It's a great enabler. I mean, look at the revolution of mobile telephony in India. Almost 900 million people have telephones, 400 of them smartphones, a lot of them on the social media. But technology also can be a barrier because technology comes at a cost. It comes also with disruption. And that's very, very critical. Let's take, say, medical technology. In a country where there are still people who might be earning the equivalent of $2 or $3 a day, and with their little patch of land, being able to sustain themselves for their own homegrown wheat or rice or little patch of vegetables, maybe working part-time a year for less than $4 a day. For them, literally, a health issue can cripple them and push them into the vicious cycle of debt. So I see this as three circles. There's the first circle, which is the circle of survival, which is literally housing, food, housing, and clothing. That's your first circle. And we still have, in the world of 7 billion people, many countries with millions, if not billions of people struggling in that first circle. Only when you have a little surplus that you move to the second circle where education and health And these kind of considerations become important because education is the means to move out of that trap of poverty with the hope and aspiration that you'll go upwards, a better future. But the new debt trap, according to me, is health. Someone has a health issue, there's no social net. Of course, our government is trying, has the world's largest healthcare program, insurance-based, called Ayushman Bharat. And our Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, just yesterday tweeted out, or was it today morning, he tweeted out that 20 million people have benefited from free surgeries over the last 2 years. Now that's cashless. It's huge. But that doesn't mean everyone still manages to reach that setup. Some of them have to go to private places. And as technology comes in, so does the cost. Take in terms of scanning the body. So now in terms of testing, you have phenomenal scanning options, but they come at a cost. An MRI may be very routine in the West. In India, it's still very, very expensive by normal standards, the equivalent of somewhere upwards of maybe $50 to $100. And that's unaffordable for a whole class of people. And there's a whole new set of scanning that's even unaffordable for people who are in a higher category. So that's the point I'm making. Technology can also be a barrier. And with every change comes its own set of challenges and issues. So we always come up with a set of change and we use technology to move to eliminate a set of problems. But we also bring in with that new technology a new set of problems. I mean, today we are talking of privacy as never before. Privacy is a huge issue. Data is the bigger issue. What's going to happen with data? Who generates the data? Who owns the data? How much of it can be anonymized, that it's anonymous? In terms of where will that data be located? Would it be located in the territory or the geographical regions of, say, India, and not in the US on servers? These are big issues. And these will be, in my estimate, a major area of legal work, as patents has been for a while. Technology would and data would be a huge set of issues in the forthcoming, maybe next 5 or 10 years. So to me, technology is merely an additional replacement in a country like India. It's not a complete replacement. It's impossible for me to, at least today, believe that this, what we would adapt or adopt, will work and change everything, and this is what we need to go. So it's somewhat like the middle path. You need to adopt it, adapt it, but we need to believe that the others will continue simultaneously. Let me give you 2 or 3 examples. And these are real life examples. Today, as we speak, we have the equivalent of what's called a hurricane in the US, but a cyclone in India, hitting and making landfall in the states of West Bengal and Orissa. That's very obvious. It'll bring down telephone lines, it'll bring down electricity. Backup systems are bound to fail when you have winds gushing at upwards of 100 miles an hour. Now, in that, technology collapses. It happened in the Chennai floods a few years ago. You had such massive floods over 3 days or 4 days that the one thing that came out from people who finally emerged from the floods, the first thing they said, electricity went. With electricity went mobile phones, many of them because their phones couldn't get charged. The internet went. With internet, credit cards went. They couldn't purchase anything. With credit cards, ATMs also went. There was no electricity and no internet. And really what worked for a large number of people was good old-fashioned neighbors, old landlines that a few people still had, literally shouting across balconies and borrowing food and saying, could you send back some food or water? Till help in an organized way came 3 or 4 days later. Now, in an ideal world, you would be in a connected world, but what happens when the connection breaks? And even today, the Indian railways, many people say that, the railways will get replaced and was getting replaced with airlines. I remember going in the year 2002 to the United States. I had to fly to Missouri. I didn't know I'd picked up Thanksgiving weekend. So, airline tickets were an impossibility from New York to St. Louis. And I had to drive another 2 hours. And my first question to Professor Phil Brooks at the Missouri School of Journalism was, can I take a train? And he laughed. He said, we don't work on trains. So I said, let me drive. He said, we are 2,000 miles. You'll have to take a flight. And I remember in that free market, the cost of my flight from Delhi to New York was less than the cost of the ticket that I was getting from New York to St. Louis. So I had 3 travel agents literally working 24 hours. And I said, find me a cheap ticket till someone cancels. And I finally got one that was equal to my cost of flying. So, the trains, but why I made the point of the trains was that with trains comes a communication line. And the railways communication network is literally proof. It's drought proof, it's rain proof, it's flood proof. And in the good old days, when we've had cyclones and other natural calamities, we've actually fallen back on these old things, ham radios, railway telecommunication and communication systems. So that's why my point is, it can't be a replacement. It can be an add-on. It should be an add-on till everyone arrives to that same mean plane where everyone is at the same plane to go to the next level. Take, I've acquired a new car. Now, with new car comes technology. Now, the first thing I need to do when I sit in my new car are 3 things that don't work in India. I need to put off with every time I start my car or it goes off at a red light. First, I need to change, literally kill or disable the automatic braking. In a country where people don't follow traffic rules, automatic braking is an invitation for disaster. It sees something in front and the sensors jam the brakes and the car behind you will jam in to your rear. And that's the end. And it's a huge bill. The second thing that I need to do is every few minutes, look at the air conditioning where air circulation is there and press the button manually for outside air not to come in. Because yes, in Germany, where this car is from, beautiful clean air. So you want fresh air to come in so that the driver gets fresh oxygen. But in a city like Delhi in peak traffic, nowadays, of course, we have limited traffic. The amount of pollution that you have, you don't want the outside air to come in because you're smoking, taking in literally fumes. So you want that off. And the third thing is I need to disable the auto go off. Every time the car comes or halts, the engine goes off. Then you press the brake, release the brake, and the engine goes on. Works very well if you don't have traffic. You don't have a traffic jam. It's a pain because your car starts and switches off every few seconds. Now that's technology that works, but it doesn't work really for India. And the showroom guy told me these 3 things you need to do all the time. So I really wonder whether I really wanted that technology. I wish I could have taken it off. So that's the second example I gave. And my final one, as an example is that, yes, the treadmill is a great option to go and 365 days a year at a time of our choice, walk in a gym or on a treadmill, but it can never replace a walk in the outdoors. There's so much more that happens in the outdoors. So I'm not saying you reject the treadmill but you have both. So I've broadly touched on technology. Now the next part is in terms of my final, just one comment on technologies. With every technology will come a whole set of issues of security, of privacy, of backup, of hacking, all sorts of things. And then there's a whole new mechanism that comes in to protect this and get us out of the mess that could come in with that. So therefore, technology and I think life is about walking together. It's not about one replacing what existed earlier till a sizable or a finite period of time has passed and everyone comes on the same page. Second is come to politics. Yes, politics is representative, and I'm kind of shifting to the liquid democracy part of the discussion. Politics in a country as wide as ours and as with such a large voter base, it's the greatest celebration in the world. It's the greatest festival of democracy, if I would call the Indian elections. Certainly, sometimes you wonder whether it's the lowest common denominator that decides what the nature of parliament would be. So it's very good for us to talk, but would I see technology being an issue in an election? If I was standing for elections, the chances are I'd be voted out terribly. I may not even hold my deposit, which means get 10% of the voters, because that's not really a concern for the grassroots level, mass of voters. For them, the issues remain still, even unfortunately after 70 years, basic primary issues. It has nothing to do with technology. But when you come in government, technology is a great tool to help lift people up. So if, say, take the case of India, or what our government has done, is introduced what's called the JAM. JAM is the Jan Dhan Yojana. So financial inclusion was a huge program by Prime Minister Modi in his first tenure. And we opened some 450 million bank accounts for the poorest of the poor. People who didn't have bank accounts till date. They had never been to a bank or opened a bank account. Many were zero balance bank accounts. Today, billions of dollars is the personal savings in those accounts. The second was Aadhaar card, which is not an identity card, but it's a unique number given to every Indian. 99.9% people have it. And the third is mobile telephony. So today you have direct benefit transfers. So even as we are in COVID-19, the other day, approximately 400 million people received a small sum of money directly into their bank account. That's 400 million people. And the equivalent of almost, that would be how much? $6 billion. Now that's direct into the account. Now that couldn't have happened without technology. And that's operational in a democracy. So, I mean, that's a very good example. Now we are looking at one nation, one ration card, so that the poorest of the poor, they'll have portability of the free 5 kgs of rice or 5 kgs of wheat or lentils that they get from at subsidized rates, irrespective of where they are. And that would cover 120 million people. So these are two examples. Because of technology, it will be possible to do so. You don't need a paper. You're connected to your mobile. You have a unique number, and it can be portable to where you go, like a mobile phone. So, but then again, there are practical parts to it. Democracy is on a high ideal. I was mentioning to Nishith and Raj earlier today that take the concept of decriminalization of politics. It's desirable. It's an imperative. How can we say that criminalization of politics should be ever tolerated? But on the other hand, it's also factual. Cases can be filed without bona fide reasons. They can be filed as motivated. There can be a false allegation. So where do you draw that line? How do you find the balance? So it's always, for me, the middle path, which is essentially finding a balance between the extremes and seeing what necessarily works for us. And my final comment is when we go to liquid democracy, and so therefore in the cloud, to answer your question, yes, in today COVID, certainly it's possible that we may see more and more meetings happening like we are having ours, and this can be extended to hundreds of people. Today, my party is having all its meetings from the very top, our national president, to office bearers like me on a regular basis, to down to the state and the grassroots level. There are 160 million registered members of the BJP. And I know that because I'm in charge of a couple of states, that sometimes 70, 80, 100, 200 people are participating on platforms like WebEx or otherwise, depending on the bandwidth, and all different platforms are being used. So yes, it's happening. But on the other hand, would this replace real-time interaction? No, it can't. For another reason, that is equally important. One byproduct of this is earlier people would travel distances and perhaps meet once a month for a big meeting, or once in 3 months for a big meeting. Today, they may do so every week. But while it saves the travel time, most of the time, a lot of people are just listeners to something they need not have necessarily been a part of. It may be concerning a particular set of people, not all of them, but because they all are part of the team, they need to be there. Or a second example I'll give is in India. I mean, this is a real example of a member of parliament who always won his elections, not because of the outstanding work he did, but he won it always because he attended every funeral, every birth, every marriage celebration. I mean, if he got 50 invitations in a day, he traveled to 50 places, even if it was for 2 minutes or 3 minutes. And the idea was, this fellow came, he's one of us. He's always there. It had nothing to do where the best roads would be, where the best schools would be. It had to do with sheer presence, physical presence, being there. Now, that's also something you can't lose sight of. So in liquid democracy, I read it, I found it as interesting, a fascinating idea. But I would ask the following questions that perhaps need to be addressed. You need a very rational, logical, informed, educated, and someone who thinks of the larger good voter to really be part of that. But in such diversity, would it work? Because could it, a question arises, lead to the majoritarian preference? And a large number of people, for example, just as an extreme example, if a large number of people say, I would like to see this be it, without looking at the implications for, say, minority views, what would happen then? Because in democracy, there is a balance in terms of when people get elected and they go and they converse with a smaller group, things sometimes go beyond what the voter always wants. Because what works for a set of voters may not work for another set of voters, regionally or even otherwise, socioeconomically. So these were some of my points. And finally, on what Brad said, just to add to that, look at what happened with Cambridge Analytica. Look at how voter preferences could be literally pushed in a particular direction to motivate democracy or the democratic voting in a direction that wasn't really fair. And that was a huge controversy. Look at what happens when we go on social media. I'm not even naming the sites. If I do a search, suddenly I find all the things that I have searched for, they start appearing on my this timeline, that timeline. I mean, is it really enhancing choice, or is it forcing me to choose out of what is being fed to me? So these are some of the challenges that will come up. And I think it's a continuous process where solutions will eventually come. But I think solutions and problems will walk hand in hand. And I don't think there's going to be the perfect one solution that works for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nalin. That was a fascinating critique and a tour de force on some of the big issues that are confronting the world of both technology, but also reinventing the very framework of democratic governance. And I appreciate your candor. Let me raise a couple of issues and then we'll bring in others as well. You know, one of the remarkable things about India, as you will appreciate, is that our ability to adapt to technology, our ability to adapt to innovation. As a relatively young person, I've seen the transition from, you know, the voting that used to happen before and to what we see today, which is the advent of electronic voting machines. And I remember when I was a student in Delhi University in the early 90s, some of the earliest presentations were made with regard to electronic voting machines. And it was simply dismissed at that time that this is kind of, so far-fetched, it doesn't make sense. All kinds of, skepticism was prevailing. And the last election, when I look at the figure for our international friends, among the 1.3 billion people in India, 900 million people are 600 million plus people voted. And I look at the data and it's quite extraordinary. 4 billion electronic voting machines were used in the last elections in which nearly 70% of the people participated. Now, of course, this is quite extraordinary. Right? This is the counterintuitive fact of India. At one level, you have these disparities that you talked about, but the same India is able to quickly adapt to technology and make it as if it was existing always and recognize its utility and evolve with it. How do you explain that phenomenon?
Maybe, Raj, since you are also in academics, the answer lies that literacy has nothing to do with education. I mean, you don't need to be literate to be educated. How does a farmer pick up the soil, feel it, and say this will not grow here? How does a potter, just by filling water in a few pots and holding it close to a fire and looking at the atmospheric pressure, that's what science is now about, tell you that it may or may not rain? So, I mean, that's education, and basically human beings are innovative. And they find and they adapt very quickly to convenience, but they don't necessarily accept everything immediately. Just in one sentence, look at the mobile phone. And from the 90s, when we started using it to today, I mean, it's undergone a massive change. But I can tell you there are millions of people out there who want and try, or even like me, who has 3 mobile phones, still carries one of these. This only makes a call, this only cuts the line, says hello. I don't even send text messages because at the end of the day, you only need a text message, sometimes a small contact book. while the other one that I have has 7,000 plus contacts. So, but I know people who don't want 7,000 plus contacts to be stored. They just want the good old Nokia and maybe the flip phone, which had only a few features. So I think there's space in a country like that for all to coexist. We need to be careful because many people are not willing to run at the pace which technology forces you to run at. The electronic voting machine was easy. It was just pressing a button. But now ask someone to come to a computer screen and then start going with his hand all across and choose and read the biodatas and then say that I would like to vote this fellow on this issue, that person on another issue, this on this preference and that on another preference, and then see what happens. Many people say, can we just go back to stamping our vote? So I think it's really much wider. And therefore I said simplicity is what works. If technology simplifies your life without disrupting it and forcing you into a pace that you don't want, it's acceptable. But if it forces you into a pace that's others are capable at running at and you can't, then it starts becoming a barrier.
Thank you so much, Nalin. Scott, I want to take that question to you because at one level, we have this Indian story of evolution from the typical old style ballot paper to electronic voting machines. And we are looking at a future of e-voting as well. And, when my wife and I, we were working in New York in the year 2000, we witnessed the entire US debacle, including the Florida debacle, which all of us know. As late as 2018, Florida continued to do the same thing it did 20 years before. And a district court judge, Mark Walker, talking about the midterm elections debacle in Florida in 2018, he says, and I quote, "We have been the laughing stock of the world election after election," unquote. Simply refused to change the model that existed 2 decades ago. How does that explain the inherent status quo of, let's say, more public institutions, public exercise of power with regard to embracing technology?
I think that there's partisan politics involved in a lot of that. It's like, in the state of Colorado, we do mail-in voting, and we have never considered that to be fraudulent or whatever. But right now, in the balance between the conservative and the liberal parties, there's often resistance in the conservative party to making voting easier or more accessible. Because when they do the polls, they find that might go against their partisan view. So the partisan politics, I think, is a detriment to true democracy, just like lobbying is on the federal level. The individual may be doing the voting, but the communication to the individuals that sway them can come from the political action committees, which are funded by corporate interests. And so you've got people looking out for their own tribe and whether they'll do well in this technology versus another technology, and therefore they find all the reasons in the world to either adopt or not adopt a new technology based on whether it's going to do well for their tribe.
Thank you, Scott. Well, the floor is open, and Nishith and Alexander and Brad and Shekhar, all of you are welcome to ask questions to Nalin or make your comments.
I think let our guest make a few comments, and then at the end I will talk a little.
Sure.
I'd be happy to make a couple of comments. Number one is with all the technologies that are emerging at the moment, we will literally vote every second of our lives. We'll vote all the time. We'll produce data wherever we go, whatever we do. And this will be the ultimate form of voting. And it will be incredibly powerful. We will literally know what people want and where they're heading. And artificial intelligence will help us do that, to figure that out. I still think the vote, as we know it today, which like once every 3 or 4 years you gather and you have a certain momentum, that will be very important, but more like an event. Because the way I see things moving, philosophically speaking, is that the event, like we're building up society towards a certain event, we're commenting before the event, we're commenting after the event, we have intentions before the event, we integrate the experience after the event. That's also going to be incredibly important. Say for any specific national territory, the vote in this sense will be a gathering. And I think that will be more important. But when it comes to politics, we need to understand that politics as we know it today, like parliamentary democracy, for example, is a smaller and smaller zone every year that we pass into the future because technology takes over more and more. And in this case, I think what politics still has an important role, because this is the basis for legislation, is to provide the infrastructure and the fairness of the model itself when we move forward into an increasingly technological society. And I think this needs to be kept in mind. I don't want to focus too much on the technicalities of how you vote when you go to the voting booth. I prefer in my work instead to focus on the overall everyday life of people in society when they literally vote with their smartphones to their behavior every second.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Brad, you want to say something? So, Nalin, as others think about it, I want to ask a question with regard to, I mean, I think you kind of briefly addressed, but maybe it'll be useful to elaborate a bit about the fact that, we have done some phenomenal, let's say, reforms. Even in your own time, the fact that parliamentary proceedings have gone for public viewing in the form of, TV channels, live parliamentary debates available. It's an extraordinary and, let's say, brave decision of the parliamentarians to potentially expose themselves in relation to the whole world. And there was a point of time a few generations ago, people would have had resisted that idea. And today it's kind of considered quite natural. So do you see that this crisis, but also even beyond the crisis, we could think of like the UK Parliament breaking 700-year-old tradition when did a Zoom Parliament session? Can we think of a Parliament session which can actually happen in some format of using technology in a seamless manner?
Rule it out, Raj, because if courts can start doing appearances, video conference, why wouldn't Parliament or parliamentary committees at least not be able to overcome that barrier? It's really not a barrier. I think it's a matter of convenience. And certainly, but would it replace parliamentary functioning? No, I don't see that happening.
Of course not, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's anyway not intention. So.
Yeah. Second is, on the TV thing, there have been two views that's again very interesting. One is that Parliament was never as raucous and, disruptive till television came in because people could actually show their constituents back home. Look, I went and I did this, which you didn't need. Earlier, you had to wait for the newspaper to report it or some TV channel to announce it. So it's brought its own set of issues. On the other hand, it's great transparency for many people. It is, look how they are doing it, and this is not acceptable. It shouldn't be like this. And when you have a great debate, you enjoy it. It's got billions of viewers, out there. If it's an international issue, because Indians globally also get that, they participate and, get to know what's happening there.
Thank you so much, Nalin. Scott, you want to respond to that or any of your comments as we come to the end of this discussion today?
Has Shekhar joined back or not yet? Shekhar and Brett seem to have dropped out.
Yes, they are not around. Yeah. Scott,
I
please.
Yeah, I do think that like what Alexander said about the that we're constantly voting, and I do think that in a large measure technology opens up the ability to understand the opinions and the sentiment of people, and that whether it's a formal vote or not, it's that public opinion matters greatly, and that is to understand how each other thinks is important. And I think that the flip side to that has been that people use those media channels to influence the way people think. And so we have the advent of misinformation, in which people use these channels to put things out there to duly sway opinions, and that I think is going to be, might be one of the biggest things we have to address in the coming years. It's the big challenge between freedom of speech and yet people being abusive of speech. It's a very similar challenge to the right to bear arms versus the abuse of holding, the wrong person owning a gun. Those are some realities that are hard to address, but they're more and more important, I think.
And those are bigger challenges in liberal democracies, which try to seek balance. Please, Nalin, go ahead.
In fact, I think Scott's raised something very dear to me, and just to add a sentence to that is, while technology has literally given a voice to everyone on the social media, I sometimes wonder we've lost our civility completely, which is what you mentioned about abusive content. And if you lose civility, how can you have a civilization? I mean, for me, that's just a basic existential issue.
Well, politicians like you are being around does give us hope with regard to having that civility, Nalin. So thank you for your contributions.
I must point out, you've said that so many times, you've been very gracious, but many people really say you're not a typical political person. And I consider myself an advocate first because that's my profession. And your profession is something what has a very wide meaning. Politics is my interest, and it's really a service area. So I draw that distinction. But yes, there are others also, I'm sure, who think on the same lines.
Thank you, Nalin. Nishith, please.
Yeah, first of all, I must thank Nalin and Alexander, Brad, Shekhar, everybody so much for contributing to what I'm trying to research for. As I told you, I'm a researcher and our law firm is also the research. What I'm trying to do is to go back and see how can we define democracy, because lawyers always start with the definitional context. So original definition was rule of majority, okay, but was it good enough? Because as Nalin himself alluded to, there could be shortchanging of minority. There could be something else, some other kind of thing. So how do you go about it? Of course, the way in which we had looked at our firm and otherwise long ago, that in a theory, okay, 60% of the decision we should try to bring through consensus. Never be all consensus, but at the same time, about 20-25% through majority, 10% minority wisdom, 5% will have to be, at a top level, somebody has to make a decision in terms of taxes, in terms of something. Sometimes, like the head has some vision, and vision is the art of the invisible. But you cannot have the veto right all the time, So the research that I'm trying to work on is how do you define or redefine our democracy, and that is where the starting point is, because then we are able to move forward to see what are the changes that we need in the current setup. As we said, I'm a constant, I would say, constructively a dissatisfied person, not in a negative sense, but constructive dissatisfaction. I'm trying to look at all the ills that we have today, whether it's corruption, whether it is biases, these, that, all this kind of thing. How do we take those components and see that can we do something better than we have today, using technology as a base, and blockchain and many other things that are coming up. So ultimately, we create the world that we want. Now, one way is to react when things come, is to design something. Ultimately, nobody knows how it will unfold. Sometimes you plan a lot of things and pandemic comes and all plans are off the hook. But planning only helps you to think further, not necessarily it will always unfold the way in which you visualize. So one of the thing that I'm looking for, and I think Nalin contributed a lot to that and everybody else, was clarifying. And let us ask the question, how should we be defining or at least describing, if there is no clear definition about democracy? Because we are all confused today. many times. What is democracy? Okay, you say rule of majority. No, there has to be some minority protection, minority wisdom, minority other kind of stuff. So it we have to revisit the whole concept, then take it to the next level. That a degree of fluidity in between, as we saw that you rightly said that you give a power of attorney. I give my power of attorney to anybody for 5 years, fine. But in law, most of the time we say we give irrevocable power of attorney. I think it has its own problems. So we have to have some system to withdraw the power of attorney, or one may agree, one may not agree, whatever it is. But some fluidity may be needed because sometimes it could go to extreme. So what is that mechanism that we can be using? We can be using it. And as you say, there are some of the value systems, some of those old railway tracks, you say, some of these things come handy. Today, what is happening? Everything is locked down. So what do? You only walk down when everything is closed down. So best transportation system that God has given us two legs. Okay, and same way, so we can always live in that. And I believe actually, as Raj mentioned about going virtual, we all had technology. We invested a huge amount in technology, but we never thought that we can sit at home and remain more busy than ever before. And the advantage that I find today is that our mind is functioning very well. Thinking time is more available to us. So we are able to accomplish a lot more. In some ways, we are more productive. But social distancing and some interactive part, how do you go about it? So as a firm also, we decided even after lockdown is over, we'll be going virtual. And virtual, we defined ourselves, or at least described that 80% virtual, 20% if you want to come to office is good and well. So coming to office, physical presence is um, uh, voluntary, and but accessibility. What I'm trying to research on or search on is how do we define or redefine democracy? Democracy started as general principle, rule of majority. But when it came to rule of majority, it had its own problems. So you introduced certain minority rights, and Nalin alluded to that. What is the new model that we should be working on? And there are a number of issues with the current democracy and representative democracy. We can pick up those elements and see how we can use technology to eliminate corruption. Has come in, for example, blockchain or technology can be used in uh, some way or the other. Like at one point of time, you go to railway station and you book a ticket and you bribe person and all that. Now person can go anywhere and get a ticket. So I think disintermediation is the name of the game for technology. To what extent we can use technology constructively, and that is what is the question. And I was just mentioning that I'm sorry, I have to repeat some of those things. Is that one way in which we're looking at that at least 60% of the decision can we see that can be by consensus. The job of politician is to create consensus as much as possible, and their job should be more educated to the public than just becoming power of attorney holder. And of course, they also do their job. I'm not saying, but the focus, and then 20%, 25% could be majority because there'll never be 100% consensus. 10% could be minority wisdom. 5% or so can be veto right because somebody at the top has to make a decision in terms of crisis, some kind of, whatever it is, but something somebody will decide. So whether we want that kind of model or we can construct something else, because today technology allows us to do a lot more things, including disintermediation. And that is why, today's representative democracy is a great thing in many ways, but at the same time, there are many ills. And how do we take those elements and, improve upon whatever we have today? And that's the whole exercise. So it's been very helpful. And let's work together. And as I said, liquid democracy is one of the things. Number of different concepts came up, but liquid democracy is being increasingly discussed at international forums. It will take 5, 10, 15, 20 years. I don't know. Sometimes things move fast. Sometimes things can take a longer time, but it is not going to be 500 years from Socrates to Athenian. And as Amazon, in 20 years' time, you know, I mentioned in the beginning, it did something which nobody thought. We thought it will take a long time. So same way, I think we are all together, and the whole idea is to discuss, debate, and see what is the world that we want. How do we shape that? What are the elements we should provide? Because with the lessons that we have learned over a period of 1100 years, can we incorporate those lessons and the teaching that has come from experiences and move forward? Those were some of my comments. I'm so sorry I lost my voice, not because of myself, but because of technology. I think that was another problem with the technology. So thank you so much.
Nishith. We are now coming to the end of this program. I'm going to ask quickly Nalin and Scott and anybody else, including Shekhar, if they have any closing remarks as we wind up this program. Nalin.
Thank you very much. It's just been very engaging. I'm sorry if I spoke too long. I didn't mean to, but I found some of the comments that came from others very interesting. So I just decided to build a few thoughts while I heard them. Thank you very much and good night. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Scott? Scott, you're muted. Oh, okay.
There we are. It's been a pleasure meeting everybody. Thank you very much.
All right. Okay, so, well, thank you very much to all of you, particularly Nalin as well as Scott, also Brad and Shekhar, and of course, Nishith. This effort has been part of Desai Associates' initiative to think in terms of Parliament in the cloud and reinventing democracy. It's part of a very important thought leadership initiative that Desai Associates has been promoting. I would like to take this opportunity to thank Nishith in particular, but also other distinguished panelists who have given us time to be part of this effort. We will again meet tomorrow with Dr. Shashi Tharoor, who will be the lead speaker, along with a few others who will join us. I want to take this opportunity to thank our partnering institutions, the Indian Private Equity and Venture Capital Association, the TIE Mumbai, OP Jindal Global University, as well as Brookings India, which have been partnering in this effort. With those words, I would like to sign off. Thank you. It's been a pleasure moderating this wonderful panel. Thank you to all of you and have a good night.